13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is Vanilla Ware's newest release onto the Nintendo Switch, but the game has also been available on PlayStation consoles in the past. This is something of a 2D side-scrolling adventure visual novel game with strategy RPG elements whenever you're dealing with a combat scenario. Now, the basic breakdown of the game is basically shown in three forms. You have the destruction section, which is pretty much the combat. Then you have remembrance, which is pretty much the story sections. This would be the visual novel aspects. And then you also have analysis, which is something of like a vague timeline with like aspects and things that you need to consider that might be reliable to some aspects of the story for any one of the characters. Now, the biggest draw to this game is the fact that you're going to be able to see 13 separate character stories all woven into one big massive core. It's essentially a story of 13 children who have these powers that give them access to and grant them the access to be able to control these big mechanized machines that are called Sentinels. They come from different timelines, so there will be a ton of like time skipping and things like that you need to be aware of. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they are trying to save the Earth from what is believed to be an alien invasion. Now, the way that this story is actually told is probably one of my biggest criticisms towards the game, because you're basically shown like one small section of one of the characters. You play through their like visual novel aspects of it, and then you get to a certain point. There's two ways to be able to be locked from continuing that specific character story, either through the fact that you need to do certain combat encounters, which we'll be talking about in a bit, or you're basically told like, hey, every single character story needs to be progressed 50% way through, or 70%, or whatever the case may be, which locks you out from being able to see that character's continual story until you meet the parameters that you're being asked for. As you basically continue each character story and progress it more and more, you get to find out more about the world that you're living in. You get to find out more about what each character's separate story is about, and basically their goals for battle as to why it is they are putting themselves at harm's way. And it all boils down to there's no one else who can do it but me, therefore I have to do it myself. That pretty much boils down most of the character's basic introductory story. I mentioned the timeline aspects and the time shifts, and that's basically because you're going to be playing in things like 1980 something, 1990 something, 21 whatever, 23 something. You know, you're going to be seeing a lot of time shifts, and this is what I think it kind of bogs down and confuses the players at the very first time that they're ever going to be able to play this game, because it ultimately doesn't necessarily weave the timelines very clearly whenever you start playing. Because of the fact that each character is kind of introduced gradually, you're not going to have access to all 13 of them at the very same time. You're going to be seeing like time just kind of jump and stories kind of like move forward, and then whenever you start your story with another character, you're realizing that you're like in the past and things are not necessarily like lined up accurately. And I think that's one of the biggest drawbacks for the game, that it takes about 10 to 15 hours for something of the story to finally start to make sense, and for a lot of people that's just unacceptable. You don't necessarily have a very clear understanding as to what it is going on. You know, ultimately it is a sci-fi story, so you do expect twists and turns at every single turn, but just the very basic of the story, you are not going to get it within the first 5 hours. That's just not the way this game kind of works. Now, as I mentioned before, destruction is pretty much the combat scenarios, and here is the strategy RPG aspect, where you are pretty much dealing with waves of enemies in a turn-based scenario, as they're like kind of like live action. They're moving towards you like in real time, but the game kind of pauses as you're making your own selections, or at the very least it slows down to a certain degree, so you make calculated decisions as to how it is you wish to engage with certain enemies. On top of that, you have this like base area that you need to protect at all costs, because if essentially enemies start to like corral it and bring it down to zero, you are going to lose the encounter. There's about 3 separate total sections of combat that you're going to see throughout the entirety of the game. They're all going to be pretty much boiling down to there's an enemy wave coming at you, you need to be able to take care of it. So combat almost feels samey from start to finish. Once you learn the basics, you kind of like understood everything there is to it. All the mechs do have some similarities to some degrees, although there are abilities that like each one of the mechs will learn that other mechs do not necessarily have. They're classified by like sections of like, this mech is for aerial combat, this mech is for ground combat, this mech is for melee focus, that kind of a thing. Your base is also going to be gaining like power boost essentially by you collecting more points the better you do in each one of the battle encounters. And battle encounters can also be set by difficulty, so you have easy, medium, hard. You're not going to miss out on anything like that by playing on easy. If you find it too difficult, again, the combat seems almost secondary to the entire notion of the story as it is, so you're not going to be punished by basically playing on easy or medium or anything like that. With that said, there are some power-ups that your base is going to require you to get that will most likely, like if you're getting to a tough situation, especially in harder difficulties, you might definitely want to be able to make use of. Those come in the form of like auto missile attacks, auto missile defenses, and stuff like that that basically can wipe out an entire wave of enemies if you time it properly, and those are always going to be beneficial to you. Your characters are going to be sent out in certain waves. They can also get tired, like if you send them out too often. So you're going to have characters that are not going to be available in a certain mission that are going to be available in the future mission, only because like if you can send them out after two waves or fights in a row, then you're going to have to like let them rest for a little bit and then let them re-engage in the future. So it's one of those things of like every single character you're going to be able to see their like mechs being used throughout the entirety of the game. You just can't have like one overpowered mech unit that kind of like engages on every single combat scenario. You're just going to be like rotating throughout the entire team, which is always good because you get to see more interactions between the drivers essentially for each one of the mechs as you progress through the story. And as that is also advancing, you're going to be unlocking things in the analysis section. Like I mentioned at the top of the video, this is more like a timeline sectioned off area, which is pretty much just giving you like key moments about each one of the characters, key things, key phrases, key people, key characters that you need to keep kind of track of that are important to any specific thing. At the end of the day, though, this is just more of like a glossary and nothing necessarily all that important. The destruction and the remembrance ones are the ones that you need to focus on. Remembrance, again, is the visual novel section of the game. Destruction is the combat side of things, and everything is sectioned off separately, so you're never going to be like too concerned with like if in that specific moment you want to do visual novel sections, you can just do that, or if you just want to focus on combat, you can also choose to do that. You're never going to be forced to having to do visual novel sections and then you have to do combat. In order for that to happen, you basically have to be ignoring combat altogether, so which is like, you know, something you shouldn't necessarily be doing. As long as you're doing most of like the combat scenarios and sandwiching between the visual novels, you're never going to be locked out of anything story-wise. And at the end of the day, the story is what is going to be the biggest driver here. And, you know, I think it's pretty good enough for a sci-fi game. But, you know, there are some issues with it for me personally, which I'm not going to get into for obvious spoilers. Now, performance on the Nintendo Switch is pretty good. The visual novel sections look clean, they look sharp. You're not going to be like having any sort of like, oh, it looks muddy or anything like that. The art is gorgeous. This is one of the biggest draws into the game, is that the visual story aspects look gorgeous. It's all like hand-drawn, animated looking and stuff like that. It looks great. There are some issues with the combat, especially in the later areas when you're dealing with plenty of waves of enemies coming at you at any one time, especially the smaller waves of like flying enemies. Those will probably have like performance issues on like handheld mode. Docked is not much of an issue, but handheld I did see a couple of that like having issues in that regard. But at the end of the day, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim I think is a beautiful game. It's got a pretty decent story that I kind of enjoyed for the most part, although I have some issues with it like I mentioned before. The combat does feel secondary. I wouldn't necessarily buy this game if you're just looking for like mech combat or anything like that. That is not what you're going to be finding here. You're finding a story of like interesting characters that is completely interwoven, and this is, I think, the best part of it that makes the game shine, that every single character is relevant to the story in one way or another, and no one ever feels left out. Nintendo Sphere gives 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim on the Nintendo Switch an 8 out of 10. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya!